Thanks for coming. I'm Bryan Biggs. I'm the Director of Cultural Legacies here at Bluecoat. And it's been, I think, 2 years since we've actually done an event in here. So this is quite unusual. It's great for us. We're really pleased to be back in person, as it were. And particularly for tonight's event, Concrete Thoughts, especially welcome, as its focus is on 2 new books. They're very heavy. And we are selling copies over there a bit later on. That consider modernist architecture and our built environment as, I would suggest, among other things, a place for congregation and public discourse. I hope we're going to come on to that. So the Bluecoat has, particularly since 2008, with this new development, proved to be a very conducive space for this type of interaction. And we recently staged an exhibition downstairs, drawing on our archive, that considered the Arts Centre's changing civic role. And this was further addressed in an online panel discussion, which Lynsey Hanley, I'm going to introduce in a minute, she's convening this evening's conversation, participated in. And if you haven't seen it, you can see that on the Bluecoat website. And that discussion looked at the challenging new landscape for arts and cultural venues coming out of the pandemic and the opportunities to become more public-facing and engaged in discourse around what it is to be civic. So as a gateway into the Liverpool 1 retail development for the past 14 years, the Bluecoat, which was restored, extended and reconfigured in a major capital scheme that opened at the start of Liverpool's Year of Capital Culture, 2008, has already had to adapt to a completely transformed and reoriented city centre and to welcome a larger and broader demographic of visitors. And as we make plans for the decade ahead, which will include the centenary of Bluecoat being the first constituted art centre in the UK in 1927, we're looking at placemaking and how we can contribute to and indeed hopefully influence the way that the centre of Liverpool will change in order to address issues around climate change, environmental sustainability and becoming a more inclusive city for its inhabitants. So we're delighted to welcome Lynsey back to Bluecoat, and she's going to introduce the 2 authors whose new books are the focus of this evening's discussions, John Grindrod and Owen Hatherley. And we extend a warm welcome to both of them to talk about their timely and substantial architectural books, which are already generating much critical praise. Architecture, just a little bit of background, architecture has been a long strand at Bluecoat. In 1910, I'm not going to give the whole history, but in 1910, Charles Riley, Professor of Architecture at the University of Liverpool, relocated his department here. So appalled was he at the school's premises that he'd inherited, which was Waterhouse's Gothic red brick Victoria building on Brownlow Hill, some of you may know, which he described as a less prosperous prudential insurance office. And he just loved the Bluecoat. Riley's students departed the Bluecoat after 8 years, but architectural practices remained as tenants in the building for much of the 20th century. And in much more recently, in 2017, on our building's 300th birthday, we organised a symposium called Concrete Utopias that interrogated brutalist architecture, concrete poetry and musique concrète. I'm not sure that we arrived at any conclusions connecting these 3 modernist creative expressions, but a walking tour the day after the symposium of Liverpool's landmark concrete buildings, from the Liver building, which is built of concrete, if you didn't know that, of 1911 to the Metropolitan Cathedral of 1967, was really invigorating. And I'm really looking forward to hearing this evening about the iconic buildings, both loved and loathed, that have since populated our contemporary urban landscape. And I mentioned our capital development earlier, and we're very pleased that Owen has included this scheme in his book, Modern Buildings in Britain. And I recently informed the lead architect on that scheme, Hans van der Heijden from BIC Architecten in Rotterdam, who was honoured to be. He said, "I hope he hasn't. He's nice about us." And I just want to read what he said because it's. I think Hans had nothing to worry about. He says, "The building is detailed to an extremely high standard, and its high gable is appropriately maritime. When it was built, the Bluecoat felt like a real holdout, a piece of scrupulous long-term architecture standing in the kitchen of a particularly insufferable party. Now, in cities that have money, i.e. not Liverpool, cheaper, paler versions of BIC's attempt to use a modernised English vernacular are everywhere. They seldom possess the grace of this excellent little building." So thank you for that, Owen, that's great. I'm just going to hand over to Lynsey, and just by way of an introduction, many of you know Lynsey as a contributor to The Guardian, but also the Financial Times and New Statesman, and she's author of 2 books, Estates, An Intimate History, and Respectable, Crossing the Class Divide. She's currently working on her 3rd book for Penguin. She lives in Liverpool and is visiting research fellow at the Research Centre for Literature and Cultural History at Liverpool University, Liverpool John Moores University, and an honorary researcher in sociology at Lancaster University. So I'm going to hand over to her. The one thing to say before I do is that we're filming tonight. If anybody doesn't want to be filmed, don't worry, because we're only filming the speakers. But if you take part in the Q&A afterwards and you don't want your voice recorded, just let Louis know, who'll be the roving mic, and he'll edit you out of the final version. So I think over to you, Lynsey. Thank you.
Wow, what a good audience. Karaoke time. It's so exciting to be doing a face-to-face event with Owen and John tonight after such a long break. There's nothing like actually meeting and talking in person. Nothing else can quite replicate it. So thank you for coming out tonight, and thank you to Owen and John for coming up to Liverpool, to the Bluecoat. I'm dead excited to introduce both of them. So John Grindrod is the author of Concretopia from 2013, Outskirts from 2016. Was it 17? 2016. And now the new Iconicon. Owen Hatherley is the author of so many books I can't list them all, including Militant Modernism, a brilliant book about pulp called Uncommon, and the new Modern Buildings in Britain, published by Penguin, and Owen is the culture editor of Tribune magazine. So they're both here tonight to talk about their monumental new books, both years in the writing, both compendious, elegant, informative, and best of all, very opinionated. So I don't think we're going to run out of things to talk about tonight. Owen's book, Modern Buildings of Britain, is a gazetteer, I love that word, of around 1,000 of the best and most interesting modernist buildings in Britain, which he started working on 7 years ago. And you visited nearly every single building in the book on public transport, didn't you?
Most of them. There are places where I kind of had to... Yes, no. There were exceptions, which are sort of mentioned at the end. Like, there's particular places like bits of the Scottish Highlands and bits of the West Midlands, actually, which, in theory, the West Midlands ought to have a fantastic public transport system where you can get around this very large metropolitan area, but as you know very well, it doesn't. So about 99% of it was by public transport, which is why it took so long and why I ended up a bit funny at the end of it.
Right. Okay, I'm glad to say that in both books, Liverpool and Merseyside are very well represented as well, because the public transport's pretty good up here, isn't it? By comparison with the West Midlands, at least, anyway. John's Iconicon picks up in a way where he left off at the end of Concretopia, which traced the story of our post-war built environment, and many of whose buildings from Concretopia also feature in Owen's book. Iconicon is about Barrett Britain. Retail parks, new builds, out-of-town malls, privatised shopping centres, and the dread word regeneration, which in this book begins with the 1984 Liverpool Garden Festival.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was amazing writing about that. And one of the weird thing about writing this book was I think everything else I've written was about stuff that was sort of happened before I was kind of conscious of it. And then it was really interesting kind of researching stuff where, I was a sentient being and these things had happened. And some of them I'd noticed and some of them I hadn't noticed. But they, it was sort of a bizarre process of trying to kind of see what was significant and what wasn't, what the things that had lasted, and then the things that hadn't lasted that were sort of really interesting. And I guess the thing about the Garden Festival was that, it's really sort of lived incredibly long in the memory, and although the site has changed, enormously, there's still a great kind of, sort of cultural memory of it and of the festival. And I'm just, I was talking about it today on Twitter, and loads of people were just, sharing their memories of going to it and stuff. And I find all that stuff fascinating.
Yeah. I mean, actually, there's significant amounts of crossover in the two books that you both feature. Is it John Outram's pumping station?
Oh no, I don't. I have the weird thing at Cambridge, but I don't have the pumping station.
Oh, not the pumping station.
Because
sorry.
I couldn't make a case for it being modernist.
Oh, too postmodern.
I do like it, but it was just like it can't.
Oh, what a shame. But in terms of the blue coat, as Bryan just mentioned, you regard this as a kind of very much an outlier in the period of the built environment in Britain that you talk about in your book, Iconicon. Shall I ask you first about the blue coat, and I think the other one that really stands out for you also is the new art gallery in Warsaw, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, I suppose there's this thing that's happening with both the festivals, that are people who've never really liked the architecture that we grew up with, sort of trying to look at it objectively, and trying to force ourselves to like it in a way. And I suppose one of the reasons for that was just like irritation at the way that architects are really dishonest about how fashion-driven they are. And there's, the most fashion-driven thing, I think, apart from actual fashion. The degrees to which, your average kind of large 20th century British architectural firm, like something like BDP, who did the master plan for Liverpool 1, will have gone through in their history kind of nice kind of 1950s Festival of Britain, modernism, brutalism, where they did a lot of really, really good buildings. Some postmodernism, which is often very questionable, a sort of 2000s kind of New Labour kind of slatted wood modernism, and now kind of the cladding everything in a grid of brick. And I suppose the thing that interested me when it was built about the Blue Coat and about Walsall New Art Gallery is that they seem to want to kind of have their cake and eat it by being both modernist and aiming to be timeless. So they didn't have, around the corner there's a building by Piers Gough that was literally called at the time the Bling Bling Building. And the amount of effort that it's going to take to explain to people what that meant in a few years' time, even now, it's impossible to explain it all. And at the time that seemed like a kind of bit of an act of resistance, that you were not going to have a kind of big Blair hat on your building. You were not going to kind of have 10 different cladding materials which turn out to be flammable. You're just going to build an honest building. And, you're going to think about light and the way the light falls, and you're going to think about materials and how they might age. And I don't think these are things that are antithetical to modernism, but by the way, but they're very much things that were quite antithetical to that kind of New Labour era that John writes about. And then what happened is that then everything tried to look like a kind of bad building by a kind of bad version of a building by Hans van der Heyden or by Crusoe Sinchen, who did the Walsall Gallery, so that everything is now clad in brick and everything is now a grid. And it's just as awful in its own way. But that fashion then is just kind of completely kind of shifted. And of course all the architects concerned pretend that they've always done
that. Do you think it's significant that they're both art galleries?
Yeah, I mean, so many of the good buildings of that era are. And it's also, I suppose it gives you a kind of opportunity to do something with context in an intelligent way, because there was often this thing that actually does link those two eras, which is really stupid reactions to the idea of context. So there was a thing then that, this building is covered in these patterns because they evoke the jewellery made in the jewellery quarter in Birmingham. And, there were architects like Meccano, who did the in my view dreadful Birmingham Library, who just seem to specialise in like covering buildings and like historical reference cladding to kind of, you know, convince the rubes on the planning committee. And then now you have this kind of like everything will be in brick because everything in Britain is made of brick, so therefore it will be in keeping, which of course is also not true. And what I liked about both of these buildings is they were very much about where they were, but not in a stupid way. So, like the new art gallery in Walsall is all about the collection. It's all about the fact that the Garman Ryan collection, which is very interesting and very odd collection of 20th century art, you know, which used to be in a kind of couple of rooms in the town hall. You know, that the entire building is designed around that and framing that and being, and it's, you know, there's a kind of almost a sort of counter tradition in a lot of British modern architecture, like Benson, Forsyth in Scotland with their kind of museums, and the British Library is another one where they're all about revolving around this thing that you've already got, and displaying that and making something of that, rather than the kind of, you know, the kind of teleport version or the kind of parachute version, where, you know, a kind of a thing comes from on high and then makes Walsall nice. Which you're never going to do. If any of you have been to Walsall, you'll know that that's a fool's errand. And there's a similar thing with this, you know, the way that it doesn't think, as someone would in the 80s, we are next to the blue coat, so we must look like a cheaper version of the blue coat. But it is like, we're next to the blue coat, so we better show some respect. So you design in such a way that, you know, that it accommodates that building without patronising it. So that's, I think, the thing that links them.
Yeah. I mean, Owen's book takes us pretty much to the present day. John's book starts in 1980 and continues pretty much to the present day. But ultimately, Owen's book is about the legacy of modernism. And John's book is about the kind of putative legacy of kind of postmodern and everything that has come since. But they're both, for these reasons, intensely political books. Reading your book, John, I think, you know, what Owen just alluded to there was the kind of the sheer shoddiness of a lot of what's being built in the period that you're writing about. And I think it's significant. Well, first, one of the things that you start with is the Liverpool Garden Festival, but you also start with the development of Docklands. So basically, do you think your book is about, or came to be about, the completely ruinous effect of money and making money the central object of what the built environment has come to be for?
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly like a big element of the story. It's sort of hard to get away from. I was sort of conscious of trying not to write a really depressing book. You know, who wants to read that? And
it's
then,
not. It's
but, thank you. But the fact is, there are lots of really like horrible stories in among all of these stories, and was sort of trying to find a way of telling the story of some of these things without kind of, you know, sort of making the whole thing feel like a very kind of like downward narrative. And I guess one of the things that really surprised me was that the Millennium stuff, which at the time, I mean, I remember kind of living through all of that stuff being kind of built and happening and being, you know, slightly cross about it in that way that, you know, I sort of feel like British people are sort of slightly cross about, you know, any new thing. And then, you know, years later, looking at that stuff and going, oh, I actually really like quite a lot of these things, and I think one of the things I like is I like what they represent in a lot of cases, in that they haven't ended up representing, as you say, the kind of triumph of money. And I feel like, you know, there were so many things, you know, in the development corporations of this era are so different from the development corporations of the Concretopia era that I'd written about before, where, you know, it was all about building a new town and that sort of thing, you know, and it was a much more municipal kind of idea. And that these ones were all much more about trying to find private partners, therefore the private partners are sort of driving what gets built and what gets designed. And the trouble with somewhere like Docklands is you end up with somewhere that it lacks just basic amenities for the people living there, because there are loads of just statement buildings, and there's a sort of, we'll build some flats and we'll build we'll build loads and loads of office space, but actually there's nowhere to just pop round the corner and buy some milk, or there's nowhere to do like basic sort of human stuff. And all that stuff is sort of forgotten because the people that are investing in that environment aren't interested in that so much, So I sort of feel like, that, and you see a version of that happening everywhere where these development corporations happen. And obviously, Liverpool is like the first place that gets one of these development corporations in this ilk, before Docklands. And that is, and it's sort of interesting that at that point, that kind of mega development stuff that then happened a bit later in Docklands doesn't happen to Liverpool at that point. Obviously there is a kind of mega development thing that happens a bit later on, but it's sort of not part of that story. It's sort of part of another story. And I guess there are waves of this stuff as we go along. And just when you think, it's a bit kind of Kathy Bates in Misery, just when you think, that's over, it's dead now, it gets up and staggers on in a slightly different guise. You're like, oh, it's not dead, it's come back to life.
But I mean, regarding lack of amenities in sort of developer-led, I was going to say developer-led developments, that's never going to fly, is it? Developer-led housing and city centre built environments. What suddenly strikes me, having read both books, is the building that comes to mind isn't one of these kind of modern-day built for cash, built for cash kind of developments. Is actually more the redevelopment of Park Hill in Sheffield, which... can you quote your own?
I can't remember I can't remember what I said, but I did basically say they should be in jail.
Yes. They should be tried before a court of law. That's what you say.
I do remember like talking to someone about it who was like, in China you would be in jail for this, and then of course the big Chinese property development thing crashed, and I don't know if they are in jail yet, but maybe they will be soon.
What, the Liverpool?
No. Oh God, and there's that. The
Yeah,
whole
that,
Chinese development in Liverpool thing. I mean, this is sub judice, right? But no, Park Hill. Oh God. Oh. I got this really weird review from a guy that I'd been mean to a few times, so I felt I kind of deserved it. Which said various things. One of which was that I should have gone to Wolfson College in Oxford, which is really boring. The other of which I should have gone to Chelmsley Wood, you'll be glad to hear. And the other was that I should have celebrated the regeneration of Park Hill. And I was just, the thing that struck me about that was that, well, they haven't finished it. Like, so Park Hill, for those that don't know, is a large housing estate that was copied all over the world. I once listened to a Jarvis Cocker radio thing where he publicly apologised to the people of Moscow in particular, where there is a large copy of Park Hill in the Chertanova district. It's kind of about 5 kind of interconnected blocks that are 14 stories at the highest point, 3 at the lowest, on a very, very steep hill behind the station. And it originally had, a couple of schools, several pubs, like various kind of shops and bits and bobs, the usual sort of urban things. And it kind of, had the usual decline as unemployment rose, and it wasn't particularly well maintained. And it got Grade 2 listed thanks to Elaine Harwood. And then the council were like, what should we do with this? We can't demolish it now. Let's give it to Urban Splash for £1. And this happened in about 2007. And here we are in 2022. And currently, most of Park Hill is still derelict. One part of it has been, given the entire building's sort of interior everything apart from the concrete frame was stripped out, and they replaced it with lots of shiny stuff to make it look like a now very unfashionable kind of like, new Labour era building with these very kind of Dosac, thick of it style colours. And And then the second part is kind of, I think, may just have been finished, which was a lot less aggressive because the architecture is fashionable now, so you don't have to make it look like Dosac. And then the other three parts are still derelict. And so I'm very much kind of like, and this was nominated for the Sterling Prize. It was like they've taken 5 times as long as it took to build the thing to turn one part of it into luxury flats and another part into student accommodation, while the rest of it is derelict, incidentally having never rebuilt the pub or the shopping parade or the schools. So the thing is a fucking disaster. And, you know, anyone apologising for it is either doesn't know what they're talking about or is being dishonest. Sorry, I don't just...
The point is in its the point is in its original incarnation. It really did have one of everything, didn't it?
And that's the weird thing about it.
As well as houses. Yeah.
It's kind of like, you know, like those of us who've lived on sort of like big peripheral estates will know that kind of feeling of like there's nothing really there, you know, which all three of us have. There's just, you know, you've just been kind of plonked somewhere. And Park Hill is exactly not that. There's a load of pubs, it's really high density, it's got pretty much everything, it's right by the railway station. It's the absolute kind of Richard Rogers style best practice. And that's what was so sinister about what was happening, is that there was all of this kind of propaganda about like, it was a terrible idea, it was awful, it was a mad utopian thing, and it was like, no, it's literal current planning policy. Like, there's nothing wrong with this at all, other than the fact that the people that live there, you know, are the wrong kind of people for the project that you're trying to do. It's just monstrous on so many levels.
Yeah, and I think what kind of is illustrated, I think, in both books is just the absolute symbiosis and necessity of places to live in and places to dwell in happily, needing plenty of variety in terms of basic amenities, but also plenty of variety in terms of access to other places and access within the places as well. Which brings me to your discussion of Barrett Homes in Iconicon. Barrett Homes weren't built with these in mind, were they?
No, absolutely not. No, and they were. I mean, Barrett was sort of interesting because it was a sort of marketing-led developer, and so what they did was they went out and focus grouped a load of people, worked out how much they earned, therefore, and then reverse engineered a house to suit that. So it was, okay, we'll bundle together all of the stuff that you might need in your kitchen and, you know, that sort of thing as part of the mortgage, and then we'll work backwards from that. So the houses sort of were as small as they could be to accommodate the dreams of the person that, you know, that had been expressed in the focus group, you know. So that was kind of the idea. And then all the other developers weren't really doing that at the time, and then they all kind of saw Barrett was doing that, and it became very successful. So they all copied it. So it became this kind of, you know, this way of building an estate. And they invented the starter home, which was this product. And that was, I guess, the thing that happened was they became products and a lifestyle product, and they stopped being, you know, you look at Park Hill, you know, all of that idea about, you know, it's a way that we want to live, you know, it's thinking about, you know, the future, it's thinking about society as a whole, it's, you know, it's got these great big ambitions. And when you look at, you know, these kind of Barrett estates and these kind of cul-de-sacs, they're all sort of based on this thing called the Essex Design Guide, you know, which was a sort of 1970s design guide specifically for Essex that was all about, you know, building in local materials, you're following a kind of local sort of idea of picturesque housing and whatever. And the developers kind of took kind of sort of bits of that idea. So superficially it looked like that was what they were doing, that they were following this thing. But in fact, they didn't use any of the local materials and didn't follow any of those ideas. They just kind of kept things like the cul-de-sacs and, you know, a few of the kind of basic kind of tropes that had come up in the Essex Design Guide, but actually discarded all of the things that I think that guide was sort of trying to do. And, you know, those estates are, you know, particularly those 80s estates, are so they are sort of redolent of the period. I sort of feel like, I sort of played on that idea of icons with that book, and that people. If you talk about architectural icons of the recent, past, everyone thinks of the Gherkin or something like that. But I think, someone like Barrett Estates are icons of the 80s, but in a different way. They're not architectural icons, but they are icons of a kind of way that, we were sort of sold a way to live, and a way of living. And the fact all those houses all kind of like, they don't connect up, like you have cul-de-sacs where all the houses deliberately are sort of skewed away from one another so that you don't look at your neighbour and that you don't, it's all about not being overlooked, which is like the opposite of those kind of modernist houses where you've got great big windows, and you're not allowed to kind of put in a hedge, and, there are all those kind of very strict rules in, all those new towns like Harlow and stuff. On a Barrett estate, it's they put up giant fences before anyone's moved in, and everything is already kind of sort of portioned off, and that is, I sort of found that kind of abrupt change of idea really even from sort of 70s Barrett, which is more like more sort of traditional streets, not those cul-de-sacs really, and 80s Barrett suddenly is this entirely new sort of monster really that they created that everyone then copied.
Well, exactly. I mean, that's why to discuss Barrett in your book is so it's more telling the story of Britain in the last 40 years, isn't it, than to talk about the Gherkin. To talk about the Gherkin and the Shard is to talk about one aspect, but to talk about Barrett, kind of describes a whole phenomenon and a whole social shift, doesn't it? Whereas Park Hill, right by the train station, brought people together, or, was aimed to bring people together. Barrett atomised and, brought about or helped to bring about the carification of Britain.
Yeah, also that fact that, as you were saying, with Park Hill, it's like got all the amenities that you could want. You're literally sort of in the best possible place. But because these private estates are being built with no kind of like bigger idea of amenities and stuff, there aren't bus routes, there aren't train stations, there aren't, the things that you would need to kind of connect you physically to somewhere. Mm-hmm. And also at the same time, you get the rise of the out-of-town shopping centre and the out-of-town business park and all of that. And I was sort of fascinated by that arrival as well, this kind of general kind of push to the edge, and to create these, these sort of edge cities everywhere, rather than, while at the same time, we've got the kind of Richard Rogers task force, or I guess not at the same time, slightly later, we've got the Richard Rogers task force trying to kind of encourage people to densify and go back into cities again, after decades of moving out to new towns and stuff. And I guess that's a sort of interesting story as well, that it kind of we're sort of like moving one direction for years, then suddenly like, oh no, we're gonna definitely want to kind of densify cities again. So it's all becomes about brownfield sites and all that stuff. Meanwhile, those Barrett estates are still happily just being built on the edge, as if none of that policy shift has happened really. So I think that as we see, they're still going on.
Yeah, exactly. As I touched on before, you visited most of the buildings. Did you say 99% or over 90% of the buildings on public transport?
Something like that.
Do you think this means that, kind of sort of tracing the story of modernist and modern buildings around the country? Because you cover England, Scotland and Wales, don't you? So, the British mainland. Do you feel like that means, the fact that you were more or less able to access them on public transport means that the story of modern buildings in Britain is also the story of urban Britain?
I mean, it is, and that means that the story is not the whole story. Like there are two things that are missing in the book, and one is missing because I thought it should be missing, and the other is missing because I couldn't really do it. And the first of those is a lot of private houses. So the other book, The Competition, as it were, which is a great book, and I don't regard it as competition in the moral sense, just simply it's the other book that does this, is Elaine Harwood's guide to post-1945 listed buildings. And it's different insofar as it's just post-45 and it's just England and it's just buildings that have been listed. But it's a great book, and I ripped it off a lot. But particularly the earlier edition that you could fit in your bag. But then there's that later one, which is also huge, and you can't. But about a quarter of it is private houses. And the early stages of doing the book, so the first draft of it was finished in 2017, like, the early stages of the book, I just constantly found that you couldn't see them. You know, like, there'd be this wonderful, even if you could get to, like, this, like, darkened corner of Berkhamsted, where there would be, like, a house by, like, Erich Mendelssohn, or by Erna Goldfinger, or someone incredibly famous, you'd then get there, and there'd be this, like, enormously high gate, and then a driveway. And you know the scene in Clockwork Orange where they go to the guy's house, which is also, isn't it Richard Rodgers and Norman Foster Team 4 house, actually, come to think of it? I think. Yeah. So anyway, that should be in the book, but it isn't, because as you remember from Clockwork Orange, the Droogs have to, like, drive from the entrance to get into the house. And then, you know, the old ultraviolence occurs. But so I was just like, this is an undignified thing to do, and I don't want to make people do it. So, you know, you shouldn't have to, like, you know, go to the outer reaches of Surrey on the off chance that you can see a house, and, you know, from a distance behind a driveway. And that basically, like, takes 90% of private houses that are listed out of the equation, because you just can't see them. Unless you've rung up the guy that owns the Marcel Breuer house in Angmering in Sussex and been like, sir, you know, could you please let me around your modernist house? That's no way to live, is it? I know that Pevsner used to do this. And, like, he used to kind of, like, contact all the people that own these kind of big stately homes. And Susie Harries points out in her book about Pevsner that you can always see when he hates the people, which most of the time he does. And he's being, you know, led around by these ridiculous kind of, like, idiots. And sort of general, you know, inbreeding, it does what it does. And you know, and one of the reasons why lots of English Tories hate Pevsner, I mean, there's many reasons, but one of them is the fact that he always slags off country houses, because he's just like, he can't keep his dislike of those people out. But and the other thing was a lot of outer suburbs. And I really tried, but there are quite like a 3-page list of things I couldn't get in. And most of them are things that are, like, out on the motorway somewhere in the middle of nowhere. And some of them I would like go to the station and hand over silly money to people to drive me in cabs. Like Norman Foster's, like, amazing big yellow hangar thing in the outskirts of Swindon. You know, I did pay about 20 quid to go and see that, and the cab driver did know what I was talking about. He was like, oh, that big yellow thing. Oh yeah, all right then. I don't think he'd done it for architects and architectural critics before, maybe he had. But loads of things like that just couldn't make the grade because you can't bloody well get to them. And unless you're willing to fork out for cabs, or unless you know someone nearby that can drive, you just can't really get there. And that is a really big part of the modernist story, because it is a car architecture, a lot of it. It's just a car architecture that imagines that you might also be a pedestrian. Like Thamesmead's a good thing for that. Like, you know, Thamesmead, another Clockwork Orange thing, where the Droogs live in a Clockwork Orange. That Thamesmead, you know, on the one hand it's got these huge, great big roads going through it, but also there are all these paths, half of them along canals, that thread you through, so it could be nice if you're a pedestrian. And the thing that Barrett doesn't do is that second bit. It's like you drive or nothing.
Yeah, I mean, the point is that so many of the buildings you include in the book are things that everyone needs made beautiful, aren't they? You know, like branch libraries, for instance,
there
you know,
are
swimming
a lot of
baths,
branch libraries,
secondary schools, all of those things. I don't know if anybody from here lives in South Liverpool, but my local library, Allison Library, is included.
Yeah, but
in
that's
Owen's
because
book.
you told me to.
Or else. You didn't have to put it in the book.
It was a good building.
No, but it's
I
a
wouldn't
gorgeous,
have known.
It's a gorgeous building.
I wouldn't have known it. Well, actually, that kind of cricket pavilion, that kind of university
Sport pavilion
that's opposite, is in the Elaine Harwood book, but she doesn't mention the library opposite, which is a better building.
Oh, right. And of course, churches.
There are a lot of
Sort of
churches, yeah, and I
churches,
am
yeah.
a kind of like, I mean, saying atheist doesn't quite work in that I was brought up in the Trotskyist church, so, I wouldn't say that I don't believe in God, but I do find churches weird, and Jonathan Meads once said I had like a, how do you put it? Sorry for the name drop, but what was it? Wasn't kind of a superstitious fear of churches, that I had a superstitious fear of churches. And I think I did kind of, for ages I felt uncomfortable in them because I felt like I was kind of taking the piss. Like if I was going in them just to look at the building and everyone else was in there because they, believed that the big man was going to help them out. Like I did feel a little bit like I shouldn't be there. And I kind of got over that eventually when I found that mostly people are just delighted that anyone's in them. Particularly with a lot of what's in there are like 1930s estate churches, because a lot of quite dull or kind of like artsy craftsy estates, like Gipton and Leeds, have like amazing kind of German expressionist style churches. So there's also quite a lot in the Wirral of the Francis Xavier Valade buildings, and like quite kind of like drab bits of the Wirral. You'll get this amazing kind of North German kind of explosive brick building in there. And they were mostly locked, actually.
Shame. But yes, I mean, by comparison, if Owen's book contains a lot of necessary buildings made beautiful, Iconicon contains a lot of buildings that were built not necessarily for things that people need, such as business parks, out-of-town malls, endless amounts of office building.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a lot of kind of disposable architecture, in this period that is supposed to be, people are supposed to have, had some kind of like environmental awakening in the 60s and 70s, and you wouldn't know it to look at kind of a lot of the things that are then built, and there's that horrible thing that happens where, out of town, malls kill the high street, and then, online retailer sheds kill the out-of-town malls, and then it's just this kind of like Godzilla sort of style kind of rampage, on a loop going on with this stuff, and with no sort of somebody is allowing these things to happen. They haven't happened by accident, and I know that the necessary sort of planning controls maybe that were there haven't been doing their job. They haven't been doing that. But these are political decisions, I think. They're not about planning. The planning is, we'll try and make these things better, as individual schemes. But the political decision to sort of have these things built at all is the thing that sort of drives the weird landscape we end up with, And I think there is this kind of horrible thing that happens where people want to kind of, they want to have a physical legacy. I'm going to have this office building, or I'm going to have this, regenerate this bit of the town, the waterfront. I mean, waterfront becomes like the big thing in this period, people that, if you can chuck up some waterside flats, beside what had been a sort of polluted waterway in this period, people will do it. So everywhere ends up with somewhere that is sort of, that has got this. And and it's a peculiar thing it's a peculiar thing because it feels like it isn't driven, as you say, through necessity. It's driven through this idea of kind of either saying, look, we've done something. I've done more to the point. I, the person in charge, have done something, and I can now put a leaflet through your door saying I did that. And so there is a sort of lot of slightly pointless stuff going on in this period, which is remarkable given that we have, housing crises and we have, all sorts of things that actually are really necessary that weren't being built in this period. So that is it's a paradox.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much that you write about housing in the book, but so much of the housing that you describe, I was constantly struck by how it didn't seem to meet people's needs.
Yeah, yeah, and I think a lot of, at the moment, there's an enormous amount of flats being built, and they are not necessarily the housing type that are needed for people that actually are really struggling. And, one of the architects I spoke to, she sort of said, that a lot of housing associations are building flats that are basically designed by, usually some young guy who, thinks, living in a flat that's got 2 bedrooms with an open plan living sort of space is fine for like everyone. But it's like fine if you're that person, but it's not fine if you've got kids or you've got a multi-generational house, or there are sort of an awkward number of you that doesn't fit into the route. There are there's a really kind of limited palette of stuff that's getting built, which is not really reflecting the kind of lives people actually want to live, or the reality of the world we actually live in. And that I think is it's proven to be sort of a really sort of major issue. But then, she was sort of making this brilliant point of that there used to be loads of little housing associations that used to be very specifically focused on individual kind of groups' needs, and that sort of was very helpful in that period when local authority housing was sort of being cut back, and they were sort of taking over. But suddenly, all of those things are bought up by massive conglomerates, and that distance, it's a gulf that emerges then between those communities and the people that are providing housing for them, and that that's a really sort of sad thing that has happened in this period, is that consolidation of little organisations, and also small house builders, all those small companies that were doing stuff don't really get the chance now, because who can deliver a giant enormous master plan to for Thamesmead or somewhere? Well, it's going to be Peabody. It's going to be some giant mega corp. It's not going to be your little local architecture practice or your little local housing association or whatever. So that is a real that's a really big problem that's happened, I think, is just the loss of small local organisations that have got an in with the people that they're actually building the stuff for.
I mean, that's such a New Labour thing, right? I mean, I really like that particular bit in the book, and I think there's a kind of the way that so many of these people kind of grew out of kind of 70s and 80s radicalism. And so they had certain things, like people that, like even the GLC in the 80s on the left were very kind of suspicious of kind of big council housing. And so this idea grew up that then people like Blair inherited, that like council housing is bad and housing associations are good. And then they brought in a policy with stock transfer that meant that you got exactly the worst of both worlds, and that something like Glasgow City Council just became a housing, its housing department became a housing association. So they became the biggest landlord at that point in Europe, and it was just absolutely senseless. Like, the entire point of housing associations is that, like, if you don't fit into this, this particular, kind of council mass building model, we could do an interesting thing for you. And instead, you literally had this thing that nobody wanted, and it was done solely in order to take loads of council housing off the books. Like, there was no real idea behind it other than just looking at balance sheets. And I think also in Blair's case, just the fact that he just thought council housing was ideologically unacceptable.
Yeah, I mean, and also just the basic loss of space standards as well. I mean, you know a lot about Parker Morris, don't you? Parker Morris
yeah,
standards.
Absolutely, and that is something that's abandoned very early on in the period that I write about. Those ideas of space standards that come in the early 60s, and actually there's been a sort of reinstatement of, or certainly a sort of recommitment to the idea of space standards being a good thing in the last sort of 10 years. That feels like that's a positive thing that has happened, is a recognition that this is a thing. But at the same time, we've got the kind of horrible kind of abomination of people being able to convert other buildings into homes and flats without any of those planning rules applying, so that you can just make tiny micro flats because there aren't rules around that, and that is a terrible thing that's happened. So to on the one hand, and that feels like a really emblematic political thing of our era. I feel that on the one hand, you can say, oh yes, we've got this wonderful thing where we're bringing back space standards, which is a thing from the past that we now think is a really important thing, that maybe that's happened. But actually, it's only for this set of circumstances, and outside of that, you can just build these absolutely horrific things which are totally outside of those rules. That feels like our age, doesn't it? Really.
Yeah. One housing development that you actually both mentioned, though, is Peter Barber's Donnybrook Quarter in the East End of London, which I don't know if anybody knows, but is an absolutely gorgeous set of maisonettes built in the East End of London around about the year 2000. And they were built by a housing association, weren't they, I think, as far as I remember. But Peter Barber has gone on to build some really, really excellent actual council housing, hasn't he?
One of the things I like about his things, and it's a shame that they are all, as far as I know, concentrated in London. I was recently, a friend who has an inn at Preston Council was looking at a kind of recent proposal being there, and like, this is terrible, what are we going to do? And I was like, let me give you the email address of Peter Barber. And whether that'll actually happen, I doubt. But one of the things I like about them, because he's done dozens of these in the last 5 years, lots of them for councils and housing associations, is that they're quite standardised. And that's a really big break with how a lot of these things have been being done for a long time, of kind of like, like you never see, like, for instance, that kind of like when I take the train into central London from where I live, you could see the difference in council towers and private by the fact the council, there'll be 3 or 4 towers of the same design. You can never do that, even if it's the same landlord and the same architect. It must, they must rise up to a point. They must be, there must have to be something that shows that each thing is totally individual, even if, they're actually identical inside. And the thing I like about his stuff is it is kind of like, so much of the best stuff that's happened, like, kind of lots of the Liverpool housing of the 30s and the London housing of the 50s, is very much like you've got a pretty standard unit, and you kind of and you can shift it about. You can use that unit to make something that's got 4 bedrooms or it's got 1, but you have pretty much a sort of stylistic thing that kind of fades a bit into the background, and that you can kind of rejig, and you can build a lot of it quite cheaply without it being crap. And this is an idea which really, like, so, I think in a lot of places, a lot needs to be built, and quite quickly, if we're going to get out of this mess, which we're not. So that's kind of I think a much better way of thinking about it than that sort of idea that everything must be special and nothing can be, to quote Alistair Campbell, bog standard.
Yeah, well, I think what's significant about his housing is that it kind of shows that you can build in quite a self-similar way without it looking really uniform and boring, which of course so much new private housing looks anyway. And I just want to, from John's book, there's a quote from Peter Barber which I absolutely loved, which I think sort of gets to the heart of what he's actually trying to achieve with his council housing, which is, I remember there was a woman, an elderly woman, who used to stand at her gate all day long, and everybody knew what was going on the street because she was a sort of conduit. And that was in a sort of more, in the kind of street layout that he grew up being familiar with. I know that in Liverpool at the moment, or over the last few years, the restoration of the Welsh streets has basically kind of restored that kind of sense of not uniformity, but kind of replicability in that area. Through a number of redevelopers, and you talk about both the Welsh streets and the Granby 4 streets in your book. That's a really hopeful note, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that was just a lovely, that was such a lovely story to kind of investigate and write about, and, to walk around those streets and, talk to people. It was just, a very hopeful thing. And it really goes against the grain of a lot of the era where, it's all lots of very big top-down strategies that get replaced by other big top-down strategies. And just to have some, some really sort of powerful, residents who are going to actually change, the landscape themselves, and actually sick and tired of, being overlooked or having all of these schemes come along that are going to knock down their houses and then they never happen. So you just have that endless kind of planning blight of an area, and just to take control of that situation and go, right, we're going to make things better ourselves. No one else is going to do it for us. And then sort of pulling in kind of relevant kind of help of people that can help them realise the things that they want to do, rather than telling them this is what you want to do. And I think that the whole story is so incredibly sort of heartwarming. And also I had sort of a brilliant experience of wandering around, because I get terribly shy going around taking photos of places, or even looking at places sometimes where people are sort of staring at you, because there's no reason why some creepy bloke is wandering around taking photos of their house. I mean, it's a terrible scenario. And and I was in Docklands and I was taking some photos of some houses. It was a completely deserted street. I took a photo of the whole street. And I posted it on Instagram, and somebody immediately posted a message under it saying, "There are children in there." And I was like, oh, just delete it. So I took it down. And then I went, I was in Grindrod a couple of weeks later, and I was taking some photos of houses. And this woman came out of her house, and she was really affronted because I hadn't taken a photo of her one. And she was like, "Why haven't you taken a photo of my house?" And she was so proud of it, and it was so funny, and it was lovely. And, it was so heartwarming, and I thought, oh, this is a difference. There's a real kind of philosophical difference going on here, with people feeling that, these are their homes that they feel really proud of, and, and that it's not some defensive, slightly aggressive act of having a house, that it's a generous, that there's a sense of generosity here, that the houses are more than just being individual homes. They are a community, and they are the life of the homes is spilling out onto the streets. And I don't think I've ever seen the streets outside houses being so well used sort of all the time. And it's the only time I've been anywhere where people are doing that stuff that you see them doing in an architectural drawing, which is, where people are always happy and flying a kite, and, they're carrying children on their shoulders and all of that. And it's the only place I've been that sort of feels like, oh, people are actually doing some of that stuff. I can't believe it. So, yeah. And then, of course, it's the very place where, the architects have been dead for, for sort of, 100 years. So.
Well, gosh, time's marching on. I've suddenly realised that we've only got about 20 minutes left, so it'd be really nice if we could open it out and see if anybody wants to ask questions to Owen and John. There's an extra mic coming round for anybody who wants to ask one.
Thank you. You both, one of you certainly mentioned the idea of timeless building. It's a three-part question, really. Is it a good thing that building might be timeless? Can you think of a building that might exemplify timelessness from either of the selections in your books? And is it possible to legislate for timeless building?
Are we doing the one? Okay. I suppose I'm interested when people try it. I think it's impossible. I think there is no such thing as a timeless building, and that's why they're fun. That's why they're interesting. They tell you loads about each time. That's a lot of why I like architecture, is that it's not timeless. An 18th century building will tell you so much about the 18th century. A 1970s building will tell you so much about the 1970s, and I really, really enjoy that. But I think there is a lot of architects, particularly ones that have studied at Cambridge for some reason, who get really, really into this idea of like, my thing will stand as an eternal monument that can stand forever. And this is, and the Blue Coat extension that we are in right now is a little bit, I think that is kind of what the architect was thinking. And I find it an admirable thing to try, but I think that people will look at it and see it as a building that came about in a particular time and says things about that time, and I think that's okay. I think it's good.
Yeah, I agree that I think, I'm much more interested in buildings that exemplify their time. And I think sometimes when a building is pretending to be from a time that it isn't from, or attempting to try and pretend to be sort of timeless or out of time, or, those buildings sort of quite often feel like they date badly because they aren't entirely of the moment that they were designed. And I sort of feel like there's a bad thing that happens. The bad thing that's happening at the moment, which is a lot of 20th century architecture, is under threat of being demolished and replaced with other stuff because it isn't felt to be, we haven't reached enough time hasn't passed to make these buildings feel kind of completely part of everybody's version of their town. And so as a result, they sort of get ripped down and replaced by something else. And I think, towns and cities really lose something when we sort of pretend that a whole era or a whole style of something was never here. A city like Birmingham, is a terrible kind of example of that all the time. I feel like constantly kind of pulling down quite recent buildings and having this kind of like sort of fit every 40 years and kind of going, oh, we're just going to get rid of all of those, but the last 40 years awful. I don't know what we were thinking. We'll just get rid of them all or put an entirely new version of that up, and then 40 years later that's just going to happen again. And that is sort of the opposite of timelessness, but I feel like there's an effort there among the people planning those things that they think that they are doing something that is timeless. But I think we should celebrate the times that buildings are actually from, and the fact that they are different and that they are varied and that they're not, that we don't live in a kind of like monoculture of the same sort of thing.
I agree with what you're saying there about buildings being sort of their time, but earlier on in the talk, you were both particularly, sorry, I can't remember the names. It's Owen. You were actually being very critical of that. You were saying, well, this is all very modest. This is the closest thing to fashion, apart from fashion, So you can't have your cake. You can't have it both ways, can you? I think you're contradicting yourself there. But can I just say that what is the solution to this? Why has Britain continually had a massive shortage of houses? Why can that not be addressed?
So I suppose that's two things. So the first one, I like fashion. Fashion's good. I just find there's a particular thing with architects that they talk like they are, at the, at Plato's Academy in ancient Athens, and act like Janet Street Porter, and I find that irksome. I think if you're going to do that, just say what it is you're doing. And I find that there's a lot of architectural firms that just change style radically every 5 years, but always act as if they're doing it motivated by the same pure ideals about pure space and pure materials. And style never went into their head, and I'm like, shut up, of course it did. But I like style and I like fashion. I think they're good things. I don't think they're insults, but a lot of architects think that both of those terms are insults. On housing, I mean, we did solve that problem between 1945 and 1979. So 100%, homelessness did continue. People did have problems with their rent. Some council housing wasn't that great. But the problems were, to a degree that we've never really seen before or since, were solved. Which is one reason why I think a lot of younger people are very into modern architecture, because they associate it with the idea that problems can be solved. And we have a political system and a media which insists to people constantly that problems can't be solved.
Yeah, I mean...
I'm a miserable git, but I try to be... Yeah, I thought that John could do the optimism, and he has.
Yeah, there's not really a lot of optimism about the right to buy. I sort of feel like that is, that's the thing that happens. I feel like, after that period that, Owen is talking about. We have the right to buy, we sell off all of these houses. At the same time, there is a moratorium on building more council houses to replace the ones that have been sold off. And that has, out of all the factors, that has been the single biggest factor in leading to a housing shortage. And that, I'm, delighted to see there are some amazing architects now who are designing council housing, and there are, those sort of, those companies set up by local authorities to try and build council housing. But that is, that's been a total mixed blessing. I'm from Croydon. Croydon's bankrupted itself on that, on that scheme to try and build council housing. And, because they had an artificial idea of the amount of money it would bring in. They hadn't factored in the time lag of you have to spend all this money to make the money further down the line. All those issues that, have now meant the council is bankrupt. So, I'm really glad that there has been a shift. There are loads of people designing council housing now that if you talk to any architecture student, they're all obsessed with designing council housing. They're all obsessed with Peter Barber. They all want to do that. They want to be that. And I think that is a really lovely and optimistic thing. But I think until the kind of political weather changes and that stuff is seen as more acceptable on a mass scale, we will never get to solve, or fill that sort of huge hole that opened up after the right to buy.
Hiya. I was going to say, so residential architecture is led so heavily by developers and ultimately the budget, and getting that as small as possible. So how do we, as architects and people in urban design, how do you break that mold? Like, what do you think is the key to breaking the mold that just the budget drives everything and creates like low quality mass housing?
I mean, there's a really weird thing, and I suppose this is going to sound sort of over theorized, but there's a particular thing, and I think it is linked to neoliberalism in this really obvious way, that you have a system, the British housing system is both incredibly over-regulated and at the same time capable of cladding buildings and stuff that's flammable. So you have this kind of, strange combination of like everything that you don't really need regulated, such as, a lot of kind of minor things about housing that make the kind of plans of housing very, very kind of boring, and, that kind of things like secured by design that make a lot of places very miserable by surrounding them with spikes and kind of cul-de-sacs and so forth. So we have all of those regulations that stop you doing anything interesting. But we somehow don't manage to have regulations that can stop developers from building stuff that's going to go on fire. So there's this really weird thing of there's a free market system and quite an extreme level on one side, but also one in which there's this kind of sometimes quite bizarre and Kafkaesque sort of state regulation that's part of it. And it's a really, again, a sort of worst of both worlds situation. And I think one really kind of like thing that sort of strikes me quite a lot, I remember talking to Emma Dent-Coad, who was the MP for Kensington for a couple of years, and in that capacity was very much associated with the kind of campaign for justice for Grenfell. And she was an architect and an architectural historian, and so understood the system and understood why it was producing things like Grenfell, why it wasn't producing, decent housing, and pretty much and I found that a lot of other people involved with housing at a political level, the shadow housing secretary at that point was a guy called John Healey, who knew absolutely nothing about housing. That there is a real kind of lack of knowledge about how this thing works. So there's kind of idea that you, in order to kind of get things working, you kind of make the machine that exists, which is, so Barrett and Persimmon and so forth. And you kind of make that machine then do council housing. And it just doesn't tend to work out for obvious reasons. And so you really do have to kind of look at the entire kind of regulatory system of it and just kind of completely turn it upside down. And I think you also have to, you know, in kind of Roosevelt New Deal sort of style, just take the big volume house builders and either nationalize them or break them up and put them all in prison.
Can you top that?
Much too high bar, I'm afraid.
Does anybody else have another question for John, Owen, or both?
Or you.
You know, there's one question I'm dying to ask both of you, actually. If anybody's still having a think. Is there a push come to shove all-time favourite building in Britain that you have, that both of you have?
I would say my favourite... Well, I've got two. One is Coventry Cathedral, and the other one is the National Theatre. They're my two favourite buildings, I think. And I have very lovely sort of personal memories of experiencing those buildings. And I think that, you know, regardless of the architecture and the history of the building and all of that, I think if you have that kind of extra sort of personal thing as well, I think it can kind of, you know, you feel like, you know, you are in some way sort of, you know, you have something that connects you to it. And so, yeah, I think the National Theatre sort of represented for me, you know, a sort of escape, you know, somewhere that I used to go and used to just hang out all day and used to just, you know, marvel at before I was sort of realised I was an architecture geek, really. And I think it sort of made me an architecture geek hanging out there and on that south bank of the Thames. So that was, you know, that place kind of really means a lot.
Anything from the Iconicon period that comes close, you think?
Well, I, as I say, I do really like a lot of the Millennium projects for that kind of, you know, for that kind of optimistic sense. I was very sad to see the dome get shred the other day. You know, that was, you know, I think after years and years of everyone else shredding it, for it to be shredded was suddenly very sad. But of all of those, the Millennium Centre in Cardiff, which got really, really sort of like bad press, you know, when it sort of, you know, started, because, you know, it wasn't an opera house, it wasn't a, you know, Zaha scheme, you know, it was much more modest, it was all of the things. But when you go round it, it's so incredibly well used. It's got, and I sort of felt like there's a kind of lovely sense of that building being a really cohesive sort of asset for a country that, you know, it's an amazing like focal point that I think maybe the Opera House wouldn't have been in quite the same way. It would have been different. It would have been a different thing. So that building, and it was funny really because I talked to people about that building and they kind of, you know, go, oh God, oh it's but I just think, you know, actually it's sort of brilliant. You know, you go around it sort of makes your heart, you know, swell. It's so lovely. Not in a kind of, you know, I'm about to have a heart attack kind of way. No. Yes.
It's in my book, and I was kind of like, and I remember one of the times I was kind of going back to Cardiff to try and make up my mind what I thought about all of that. It was kind of just, I suppose, the thing that it is a good building, and I think that, but I think lots of it is just the fact that the problem with Cardiff Bay was that it had like two very good buildings, one good building that's not there anymore, which was that weird Alsop thing, and the Pierhead building, which is also quite nice in a kind of prudential assurance way. And then around it, just some of the worst public spaces and retail buildings and restaurants that you've ever seen. And so it was this really kind of like, you know, that actually the designers of those two buildings had done their utmost. And then everything else just went to pot. But so I think I'm talking about Millennium Centre, so I don't have to answer the question. So the ones that came to, I kind of raced through a whole load and then was like, no. So I immediately thought of, actually, in terms of what Rodney Gordon, who designed various amazing kind of brutalist buildings, most of which have been demolished, only one of which is in the book, which is Eros House in Catford, which hasn't been demolished but has been altered very badly. Once was talked about, his idea of architecture being something which, and you should adjust this for your own genitalia, something that gives you that feeling from your balls to your throat. And I think that the best buildings are those that exactly do that. They give you that kind of quake, just like, this is a thing. And sometimes the buildings that do that are buildings which actually, loads of other ways, I find really problematic. So there's always a sort of a disjunction between sort of as architectural historian and liker of architecture and as Trot, where I often am so the Lloyd's building is the really big one of that. I think the Lloyd's building is an absolute architectural masterpiece. It's as good as Hawksmoor. It's it's one of the finest buildings built in London by anyone in the 2,000 years that city has existed. But I always feel a bit uncomfortable about it because, it's built for an office of slave underwriters. It's got a moat around it, basically. It's a security feature. And the kind of architectural theory behind it, the idea that it could be adapted and so forth, is total bollocks because they detailed everything so beautifully that no one would want to adapt it, because why would you want to take anything away from this gorgeous machine? So I have this kind of constant kind of push-pull thing of I love everything about this and also find it really maddening. So then I was could be the Barbican, and I was no, the Barbican's far too pleased of itself, so not the Barbican. And then I thought of Park Hill, and obviously I've already talked about that. So I've got 3, and they're all things where if I'm ever in that place, I make a point of going to kind of to check up on it. And one is the Delaware Pavilion in Bexhill-on-Sea, which is just such a gorgeous, generous public building, such a sort of sense of lushness and futurism that's sort of done with you rather than at you, as Ian Nann once said about something else. And I also like that building, especially because it so much exemplifies that fact of although modernity is very much invented in Britain, I think, modernism is a thing that there's always been a bit of a problem with. And so you had this situation in the 30s where, people like Mendelssohn and Gropius sort of brought us the gospel. And I think a lot of revisionist historians are doing this, no, everything was fine in the 20s, Lutyens was great, it's absolutely fine that everything was classical in the 20s and 30s. And I disagree with this, and I think it's good that, a load of German Jewish refugees came here and gave us good modern architecture. I thank them on a regular basis. The other one is the Biker Estate in Newcastle. Every time anywhere in Newcastle, I go there and I check on it, and the way that kind of squares various circles, it feels like a huge, great collective work, and feels like a kind of huge part of a city in which people live in a kind of one large entity, but it also has that sort of incredible sort of attention to detail and individuality and small scale, as well as, it has a giant scale and a small scale at once in a really, really impressive way. And it's really, it was pretty much the last big estate to be built. And it pretty much showed that you could have just kept building estates like that. People were learning. It was so much an estate that was kind of well, we like some things about Park Hill, but we don't want to do that in the same way, because sometimes people find that alienating. So we're going to do it like this. And instead of it having loads of successors, it didn't have any. But it's the real kind of road not taken, and I really I've often been very moved by going there. And the other one is Wyndham Court in Southampton, which is a big and very aggressive, brutalist kind of mini estate outside Southampton Central Station. And it's where I grew up, and that is my kind of experience of the thing that got me into architecture is that building, which is this sort of, really sort of, you can kind of pull all sorts of evocations of it kind of looking like a ship, or looking like a castle, or it looking like all of these sorts of, or looking like a kind of Jacob Epstein rock drill sculpture, or all sorts of things. But, and it also has the fact that the flats inside are really big and really nice, which is an important part of this, which is lost a lot in a lot of recent housing. And I stop now.
Yes. Yeah. Before we finish, is there a teeny tiny question? Otherwise, we need to wrap up now. Yeah, it'll have to be a quick one. We've just got a couple of minutes.
3 words. Are we doomed?
I'm still a member of the Labour Party somehow. I think mainly because I've just pretended it doesn't exist. I think that... So I started doing this sort of thing in about 2007 and 8, and gave actually one of the first public lectures I ever gave at Liverpool when it was capital of culture at the Tate. And at that point, not so much in Liverpool, but in a lot of other cities, an analysis like this, if you call it an analysis, you know, the stuff that we are talking about, people would look at you like you had 2 heads. If you were to say, we need a load of council housing, privatisation hasn't worked, the private finance initiative is a bad idea, cities should be more collective, you know, people should have more democratic power in how they're built. People would generally, in like about 2008, be like, what's your problem? Everything's wonderful, you know. And what could you possibly not like about Liverpool 1? And, you know, I actually don't mind Liverpool 1, but you know what I mean? There was very much a kind of like, there was sort of an era of, and this goes back to being a miserable git and the importance of being a miserable git. Very much at that point, there was a real kind of like, you know, that sort of Superland banana era of just like, everything's brilliant! And it wasn't brilliant. And it stored up a whole load of bloody problems which we're now having to suffer through. And because of that, by and large, a lot of people are now have the view that we need to build a lot more social housing. The free market can't do everything. You know, the privatised utilities have been worse since they're privatised. These are all things that I would now think probably the majority of people, probably a small majority in most of the country, but a large majority in Liverpool or London, now think these things. So the next step is to then have political representation for those views so that you can enact them in government.
I think sort of I was doing some stuff with students, some architecture students the other day at Nottingham. You know, talking to them, it's very hard not to feel very optimistic, you know, in the way that they were approaching their work, you know, the way that they were talking about, you know, their ethical stance on what they were building, the sort of sustainability and kind of eco-credentials of how they were trying to do it, how they were facing up to all these big problems that we were all agonising about. And so from that, and from kind of working with them, I'm feeling optimistic that there is a sort of engaged generation of people sort of coming up, and that there is a sort of sea change, as you said, you know, in terms of, you know, that it doesn't feel like, you know, these things are such a kind of outrage as they had once seemed. So, but at the moment, of course, you know, we are kind of squatted on by the worst possible group of leeches. So until those people are kind of, you know, chased to the moon by spiders or something, you know, I don't quite know what we do really. So but I think sort of bubbling up underneath that kind of horrible corruption, there is something good, and I have to cling on to that.
That is a really good note to end on, I think. Thank you, Owen and John. Can you please show your appreciation?
Thank you very much.